The rock stopped mid-air as William Thompson stepped between the snarling crowd and the bloodied German shepherd, his weathered hands trembling not with fear, but with rage that cut through the morning silence like thunder. What should have been another peaceful sunrise in Harmony Gardens had exploded into chaos. Children screaming, parents shouting, stones flying at a dog who refused to abandon his post beside the old oak tree. Margaret Sullivan's voice cracked above the din. "That monster tried to attack my Emma." Her designer purse clutched to her chest like armor, tears streaming down her face as she pointed an accusing finger at the shepherd who sat motionless despite the gash above his amber eyes. The sight struck Bill like a physical blow. This magnificent creature, scarred and bleeding, yet maintaining his vigil with the dignity of a soldier who'd forgotten how to retreat. "Stop!" Bill's command cut through the hysteria, his teacher's voice still carrying decades of classroom authority. But high above them all, hidden in the ancient oak's branches, a camera had been recording everything, and what it captured would shatter every assumption this small Missouri town had about heroes, villains, and the thin line between salvation and destruction. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, William Bill Thompson had awakened to the same ritual that had governed his morning since Martha's funeral. 2 coffee cups pulled from the cabinet, one quietly returned. At 68, the retired history teacher moved through his small ranch house with the measured precision of a man who'd spent 40 years maintaining classroom discipline, though now his only students were the dust motes dancing in the early Springfield sunlight. The pension check that arrived each month, $1,247 after taxes, stretched like worn elastic across mounting bills. Bill had learned to count quarters twice, to choose between heating and medication, to smile when neighbors asked how he was managing. "Just fine," he'd say, the lie coming easier each time. Martha used to handle their finances with the same gentle efficiency she'd brought to everything else, leaving Bill to discover too late how much her teacher's salary had supplemented their modest life. His daily walk to Harmony Gardens Park served as both exercise and escape from the house that echoed with 43 years of shared conversations. The park had been Martha's favorite place, where she'd insisted they'd build their retirement dreams, a small garden, maybe some volunteer work with the Historical Society. Now Bill sat alone on their bench, feeding pigeons from yesterday's bread while struggling with the history book they'd planned to write together. Eleanor Patterson understood loneliness in ways her neighbors couldn't imagine. At 64, she rattled around her Victorian mansion like a marble in an empty jar, the silence broken only by the grandfather clock that marked hours nobody shared. Her children called dutifully on holidays, their voices carrying the hollow politeness of obligation across 1,000 miles of geographic and emotional distance. What the town didn't know, what Eleanor had spent 5 years carefully hiding, was that Harold's insurance had left her with $2.3 million. She'd learned that money couldn't buy the one thing she craved most, genuine human connection. So she shopped at thrift stores, clipped coupons religiously, and listened carefully when neighbors complained about their struggles, testing whether their kindness extended beyond her presumed financial status. The German shepherd appeared on a Tuesday morning in late June, materializing like a ghost beside the park's centerpiece oak tree. Bill noticed him first, a magnificent creature with intelligent amber eyes and a coat that spoke of better days. The dog's right rear leg bore the telltale signs of an old injury, and his ribs showed through patchy fur, but his posture remained dignified, alert. Dr. James Mitchell would later explain that German shepherds typically lived 12 to 14 years, making this one, roughly 8 years old, middle-aged by canine standards. What the veterinarian couldn't explain was why the dog had chosen this particular spot, this specific bench, or why he seemed to be waiting for something only he understood. For 3 weeks, the shepherd maintained his vigil. accepting neither food nor comfort from well-meaning passers-by, his amber gaze fixed on some invisible horizon that spoke of purpose beyond human comprehension. The morning Bill Thompson first offered the German Shepherd a piece of his breakfast sandwich marked the beginning of something neither man nor dog had planned. It was a Thursday, exactly 30 days before the incident that would divide their small Missouri town, and the late June heat was already pressing down on Harmony Gardens like a heavy quilt. "You're not my responsibility," Bill muttered, tearing off a corner of his ham and cheese sandwich. The dog's amber eyes tracked the movement, but he made no move toward the offering. "Martha always said I was too practical for my own good." He placed the food on the ground halfway between the bench and the oak tree, close enough to show intent, far enough to respect boundaries. The shepherd waited until Bill had walked 20 yards toward the park exit before approaching the food. Bill watched from the corner of his eye as the dog ate with surprising delicacy, as if remembering better days when meals came on schedule and kindness wasn't rationed. Something about that dignity, the way the animal maintained his composure despite obvious hunger, reminded Bill of his old students, the ones who'd shown up to class with empty stomachs but full hearts. That evening, Bill discovered the dog had followed him home. Not aggressively, not begging, just maintaining a respectful distance until Bill disappeared inside his house. The next morning, he found the shepherd sleeping on his front porch, positioned to watch both the street and the door. The practical thing would have been to call animal control. Instead, Bill found himself leaving a bowl of water beside the porch steps. Margaret Sullivan noticed the pattern first. As president of the Springfield Elementary PTA and grandmother to 6-year-old Emma, Margaret had developed an eagle eye for anything that might threaten the children who played in Harmony Gardens after school. The German Shepherd's presence, she decided, represented an unacceptable risk. "That dog is stalking our children," she announced at the monthly town meeting, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Yesterday, he followed Emma and her friends to the playground equipment. When I approached to shoo him away, he showed his teeth." Bill, who had attended every town meeting for the past 15 years out of civic duty and loneliness in equal measure, found himself standing before he'd consciously decided to speak. "Ma'am, with respect, I've been watching that dog for 2 weeks. He's never shown aggression toward anyone." "Mr. Thompson," Margaret's tone suggested she was addressing a particularly slow student. "Perhaps your eyesight isn't what it used to be. That animal is dangerous and it needs to be removed before something terrible happens." Eleanor Patterson, seated in her usual spot in the back row, watched the exchange with growing interest. She'd been feeding the shepherd secretly for a week, leaving small portions of her own meals near the oak tree during her evening walks. The dog had never approached while she was present, but the empty plates the next morning told their own story. "Has anyone actually seen this dog behave aggressively?" Father Michael O'Connor asked from his seat near the front. The 70-year-old priest had been moderating town disputes since before most residents had moved to Springfield. Or are we discussing theoretical dangers? The question hung in the air like humidity. Margaret's face flushed. "He doesn't have to attack someone for us to recognize the threat." "Large dogs, especially strays, are unpredictable. We have a responsibility to protect our community." Sheriff Tom Bradley, who had been listening with the patience of a man accustomed to mediating neighborhood disputes, cleared his throat. "I'll increase patrols through the park. If the dog shows any aggressive behavior, we'll handle it through proper channels." 3 days later, the first complaint reached the sheriff's office. Mrs. Henderson from Maple Street reported that the German Shepherd had barked at 2 teenagers who were acting suspicious near the park's equipment shed after dark. When Bradley investigated, he found no evidence of vandalism or theft, but he did notice fresh cigarette butts and an empty beer bottle hidden behind the building. The second complaint came from Tom Brewster, who delivered mail to the businesses surrounding the park. The dog had given him the stink eye when he'd stopped to photograph the park's memorial plaques for his wife's garden club newsletter. What Brewster didn't mention was that he'd been using his phone to take pictures of more than plaques, specifically the patterns of when children played unsupervised and which areas of the park offered the most privacy. By the third week of July, the complaints had multiplied like summer weeds. The German Shepherd, according to various reports, had menaced joggers, frightened elderly visitors, and created a general atmosphere of unease. Each incident, when examined closely, revealed inconsistencies that Sheriff Bradley found increasingly troubling. The dog wasn't randomly aggressive, he was selectively vigilant, focusing his attention on specific individuals whose behavior, Bradley was beginning to realize, deserved scrutiny. But in a town where perception often mattered more than reality, the shepherd's protective instincts were being interpreted as predatory ones. The anonymous calls to animal control began arriving daily, each demanding immediate action against the dangerous stray terrorizing our park. The discovery that would change everything began with a routine maintenance check on a sweltering Tuesday morning in mid-July. Jerry Martinez, the city's part-time groundskeeper, was trimming dead branches from the ancient oak tree when his ladder shifted, revealing something that shouldn't have been there. A small, weatherproof camera nestled among the leaves, its lens pointing directly at the bench where the German Shepherd maintained his daily vigil. "Sheriff Bradley?" Jerry's voice cracked slightly as he spoke into his cell phone, still balanced precariously on the ladder. "You're gonna want to see this. Someone's been watching the park, and I mean really watching it." Within an hour, Sheriff Tom Bradley stood beneath the oak tree, squinting up at the sophisticated surveillance equipment that had been carefully concealed among the branches. The camera was no amateur setup. It was professional grade, weatherproofed, with what appeared to be wireless transmission capabilities. More disturbing was the realization that whoever had installed it had chosen the perfect vantage point to monitor not just the shepherd's behavior, but every interaction between the dog and the park's visitors. "How long has this been here?" Bradley asked Jerry, though he suspected neither of them would like the answer. "Could have been weeks, maybe months," Jerry replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "This oak's so thick you'd never spot it from the ground. Whoever put it there knew what they were doing." The equipment required a warrant to examine properly, but Bradley's preliminary investigation revealed memory cards that suggested the camera had been recording continuously for at least 3 weeks, exactly the period when complaints about the German Shepherd had begun escalating. The implications sent a chill down the sheriff's spine despite the oppressive heat. That afternoon, while the sheriff worked through legal channels to access the camera's contents, the situation at Harmony Gardens reached its breaking point. Emma Sullivan, Margaret's 6-year-old granddaughter, had convinced her babysitter to take her to the park during the lunch hour when the playground was typically empty. Emma had been fascinated by the German Shepherd from a distance, and today she'd decided to approach him with a handful of crackers saved from her lunch. The dog, as had become his custom, was resting in the shade of the oak tree, his amber eyes scanning the park with the methodical attention of a trained sentinel. When Emma began walking toward him, the shepherd's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Not aggressive, but alert, focused, not on the approaching child, but on something beyond her. Carl Morrison had been watching the park for 45 minutes from his position near the maintenance shed, waiting for exactly this opportunity. A registered sex offender with a history of targeting young children, Morrison had been studying the patterns of park usage, identifying windows when children might be alone or inadequately supervised. Emma Sullivan, with her blonde pigtails and trusting smile, represented the perfect victim. Morrison began his approach just as Emma reached the German Shepherd, moving with the practiced casualness of a predator who understood that confidence was his best camouflage. He was 15 feet away when the dog's behavior changed dramatically. The German Shepherd rose to his feet with fluid grace, positioning himself directly between Emma and the approaching stranger. When Morrison continued forward, the dog issued a low growl that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than his chest, a sound that spoke of violence held in careful restraint. "Nice doggy," Morrison said, his voice carrying the false friendliness he'd perfected over years of manipulating children. "I'm just saying hello to the little girl." The shepherd's response was immediate and unmistakable. He grasped the back of Emma's shirt gently but firmly in his teeth and pulled her backward, away from Morrison, while maintaining eye contact with the man who had stopped advancing but hadn't retreated. Emma, startled by the sudden contact, let out a sharp cry that carried across the park like a fire alarm. Her babysitter, who had been distracted by her phone, looked up to see what appeared to be a large dog attacking her charge. Her scream brought immediate attention from other park visitors, including Margaret Sullivan, who had arrived early to pick up her granddaughter. "He's attacking Emma!" Margaret's voice cut through the afternoon air with the force of absolute panic. Within seconds, a crowd had gathered, their combined outrage focused on the German Shepherd who still held Emma's shirt in his teeth, refusing to release her until the stranger backed away. Morrison, recognizing that his opportunity had vanished, melted into the crowd of concerned adults, his presence forgotten in the chaos surrounding the apparent dog attack. By the time someone thought to look for the man who had been approaching the child, he had disappeared entirely. The first rock was thrown by a teenager whose younger sister had been playing nearby. It struck the German Shepherd on his left shoulder, but the dog maintained his protective stance, his body shielding Emma even as additional stones began flying. The animal's refusal to retreat, which the crowd interpreted as continued aggression, only escalated their fury. It was into this maelstrom of misunderstanding and mob mentality that Bill Thompson arrived, drawn by the sounds of chaos from 3 blocks away where he'd been running errands. The sight that greeted him, a magnificent animal being pelted with rocks while protecting a child from something only he could see, triggered something primal in the retired teacher's chest. "Stop!" Bill's command carried 40 years of classroom authority, cutting through the hysteria like a sword through silk. "He's protecting her, not attacking her." But the crowd's blood was up, their fear transformed into righteous anger, and Bill found himself standing alone between an injured dog and a mob that had already decided who the villain was. The German Shepherd, bleeding from cuts above his amber eyes, looked at Bill with an expression that seemed to say, "Finally, someone who understands." What none of them knew was that 30 feet above their heads, the hidden camera was recording every moment of the confrontation, capturing evidence that would soon reveal who the real predator was. The emergency veterinary clinic on Elm Street had seen its share of animal trauma, but Dr. James Mitchell had never treated a dog injured by an angry mob. As he cleaned the cuts around the German Shepherd's amber eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that this magnificent animal was somehow familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have encountered him before. "He's going to need stitches for the deeper cuts," Dr. Mitchell told Bill, who hadn't left the dog's side since carrying him into the clinic. "But what concerns me more is his overall condition. This dog is malnourished, and I can feel some old injuries that were never properly treated." Bill's weathered hands stroked the shepherd's head as the dog lay sedated on the examination table. "He's been living rough for a while. I should have brought him in sooner." "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Mitchell paused in his examination, "this isn't a stray dog. Look at his teeth, his muscle tone despite the malnutrition, the way he responds to commands. This animal has had extensive training. Military or police, I'd guess." The revelation hit Bill like a physical blow. He thought of the dog's disciplined behavior, his protective instincts, the way he'd positioned himself between Emma and danger without hesitation. If he's trained, then why is he here? Why isn't he with his handler? Dr. Mitchell's expression grew somber. That's a question I can't answer. But I'll tell you this. Whoever trained him did it with kindness. Despite everything he's been through, he still trusts humans enough to let us help him. While the shepherd recovered from his injuries, Sheriff Bradley was making discoveries that would shake the foundation of Springfield's assumptions. The hidden camera's memory card contained 3 weeks of continuous footage, and what he found there painted a picture so different from the community's perception that he had to review it twice to believe his own eyes. The German Shepherd hadn't been randomly aggressive toward park visitors. He'd been systematically protecting them from Carl Morrison, a registered sex offender who had been stalking children with methodical precision. The footage showed Morrison photographing the playground equipment, timing children's routines, and approaching young visitors when they were alone or inadequately supervised. In every instance, the shepherd had intervened, positioning himself between Morrison and potential victims. The dog had saved Emma Sullivan, just as he'd protected at least 4 other children whose parents had never realized they'd been in danger. The aggressive behavior that had sparked community outrage was actually heroic intervention by an animal who understood threats that the adults around him had missed entirely. Bradley immediately issued an APB for Morrison's arrest, but the man had vanished as thoroughly as morning mist. His last known address was abandoned, his car found burned out in a field 20 miles outside town. It seemed that Morrison had been using Springfield as a hunting ground, and the German shepherd's presence had forced him to abandon his carefully laid plans. The sheriff's next visit was to Bill Thompson's modest ranch house, where he found the retired teacher sitting on his front porch with the bandaged shepherd resting at his feet. Eleanor Patterson occupied the chair beside them, and the 3 seemed to form a natural family unit that hadn't existed a week earlier. "I owe you all an apology," Bradley began, removing his hat as he approached the porch. The camera footage tells a very different story from what we thought we saw. As Bradley explained what the surveillance equipment had revealed, Bill felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow wash over him. The dog who had chosen his protection was a hero who had been reviled for his heroism, punished for the very actions that had kept children safe. "There's something else," Bradley continued. "The camera wasn't installed by Morrison. The equipment is too sophisticated, too well positioned. Someone else has been watching the park, and I think they've been watching this dog specifically." Eleanor leaned forward in her chair, her hand instinctively moving to rest on the shepherd's head. "Watching him why? What could they want with a dog?" "That's what I intend to find out," Bradley replied. "In the meantime, I'd appreciate it if you'd keep him close. Until we know who's behind this surveillance operation, I can't guarantee his safety." The town meeting that followed was unlike any in Springfield's history. Word of the sheriff's discoveries had spread through the community like wildfire, transforming public opinion overnight. The same neighbors who had thrown rocks 3 days earlier now arrived with flowers, homemade treats, and stammering apologies. Margaret Sullivan approached Bill with tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He saved Emma, and we tried to hurt him." "He's a forgiving soul," Bill replied, gesturing to the shepherd who sat calmly despite being surrounded by many of the same people who had recently attacked him. "Dogs understand fear better than we do. They don't hold grudges the way humans do." Father O'Connor rose to address the gathering, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of human observation. "We've learned something important about ourselves this week. We were so afraid of what we thought we saw that we couldn't recognize the hero standing right in front of us." But even as the community celebrated their newfound understanding, new mysteries were emerging. Dr. Mitchell had discovered something during his examination of the shepherd that added another layer to the puzzle. A microchip containing information that made his blood run cold. The dog's name was Duke, and according to the chip's registry, he had belonged to Robert "Bobby" Chen, a Vietnam veteran who had received the animal as part of a therapy program for PTSD. Bobby had been one of Bill's students 30 years earlier, a bright kid who'd struggled with the transition from adolescence to adulthood in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to young men like him. Bill remembered Bobby clearly, a quiet student who'd always sat in the back row, who'd written surprisingly insightful essays about the cost of war despite never having experienced combat himself. When Bobby enlisted after graduation, Bill had worried about him. When he'd returned from Vietnam, changed and broken, Bill had tried to reach out, but Bobby had retreated into a silence that seemed impenetrable. The records showed that Bobby had adopted Duke 2 years earlier as part of his treatment for severe PTSD. The therapy dog had been specially trained to recognize the signs of emotional distress and provide comfort during panic attacks and episodes of despair. For 18 months, Duke had been Bobby's constant companion, his lifeline to stability in a world that often felt overwhelming. 3 months ago, Bobby Chen had taken his own life. The discovery hit Bill like a sledgehammer to the chest. He'd known Bobby was struggling, the whole town had known, but like so many others, Bill had assumed that time and distance would heal wounds that ran deeper than anyone understood. Bobby's suicide had been covered quietly in the local paper, noted as a tragedy, but discussed in the hushed tones reserved for events that communities prefer to forget. Duke had been at the scene when Bobby died. The police report, which Bradley obtained through official channels, noted that the dog had remained with his owner's body for 2 days before neighbors finally called for a welfare check. Animal control had been summoned to collect the dog, but Duke had escaped during transport and disappeared into the Missouri countryside. For 3 months, Duke had been searching for something, purpose perhaps, or simply a reason to continue living. His appearance at Harmony Gardens, at the specific bench where Bobby used to sit during his better days, wasn't random. It was a pilgrimage, a final attempt to honor the memory of a man who had given him purpose and love before the demons of war finally claimed their victory. Eleanor, who had been listening to Bill share Bobby's story with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, reached out to stroke Duke's head with infinite gentleness. "He's been mourning," she whispered. "All this time he's been grieving just like we do." The realization that Duke was a veteran's dog, trained specifically to provide emotional support and protection, explained everything about his behavior. His protective instincts hadn't been random aggression. They were the continuation of his mission to serve and protect, transferred from his lost handler to the community that had become his reluctant family. But Duke's health was deteriorating rapidly. The combination of 3 months of rough living, inadequate nutrition, and the emotional trauma of losing Bobby had taken a severe toll on his body. Dr. Mitchell's blood work revealed early-stage kidney disease, a condition that would require expensive treatment and careful monitoring for the rest of the dog's life. The estimated cost of treatment, $15,000 for surgery and ongoing medication, represented more than Bill's entire annual discretionary income. His pension covered basic living expenses with little margin for emergencies, and the house he'd shared with Martha was mortgaged to help pay for her cancer treatments. Eleanor, watching Bill struggle with the financial reality of Duke's care, made a decision that surprised even herself. She'd spent 5 years hiding her wealth, testing people's kindness before revealing her resources. But Duke's need transcended her usual caution. "I'll pay for his treatment," she announced quietly, her words cutting through Bill's anguished calculations. "All of it, whatever he needs." Bill's pride warred with his desperation. "Eleanor, I can't accept that kind of generosity. It's too much." "It's not generosity," Eleanor replied firmly. "It's an investment in family. This dog has given me more joy in 3 weeks than I've felt in 5 years. He's brought us together, created something I thought I'd lost forever when Harold died." You can't put a price on that kind of gift." As if sensing the conversation concerned him, Duke lifted his head to look at the humans who had become his unlikely pack. His amber eyes, still bearing the small bandages from his recent injuries, held a wisdom that spoke of service and sacrifice, of love freely given despite the cost. The hidden cameras throughout the park had been discovered and removed, but their purpose remained a mystery. Someone had invested considerable time and money in monitoring Duke's activities, and that someone was still out there, watching and waiting for reasons none of them could fathom. The black Mercedes with tinted windows had been circling Springfield's downtown district for 3 days before anyone noticed it didn't belong. In a town where most residents drove pickup trucks or aging sedans, the luxury vehicle stood out like a raven among sparrows. Sheriff Bradley finally took notice when Mrs. Henderson called to report that the same car had driven past the park 6 times in one afternoon, slowing each time it passed the oak tree where Duke maintained his vigil. The woman who emerged from the Mercedes at precisely 2:30 p.m. on a sweltering August afternoon carried herself with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Victoria Sterling appeared to be in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed despite the heat, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight and eyes the color of winter sky. She moved toward the small crowd gathered around Duke with the purposeful stride of someone who had places to be and deals to close. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying just enough authority to command immediate attention. "I'm looking for the owner of that German Shepherd." Bill looked up from where he was sitting beside Duke, immediately suspicious of this polished stranger who seemed so out of place in their small community. "He doesn't have an owner. He's with me, but he's nobody's property." Victoria's smile was professionally warm, but somehow failed to reach her eyes. "I'm Victoria Sterling from Sterling Development Corporation. We've been following the story of your heroic dog, and I believe we might be able to help each other." The name Sterling Development meant nothing to most of Springfield's residents, but Eleanor Patterson had spent enough years managing her late husband's investments to recognize it immediately. Sterling Development was a major player in luxury real estate across the Midwest, specializing in transforming underutilized properties into high-end residential and commercial developments. "What kind of help?" Bill asked, his teacher's instincts detecting something beneath Victoria's polished presentation that set his teeth on edge. "We're always looking for compelling stories to anchor our development projects," Victoria replied smoothly. "A therapy dog who protected children, a community that rallied around a hero, it's exactly the kind of heartwarming narrative that makes people want to be part of something special." She gestured toward the park with a sweeping motion that somehow managed to encompass the entire area in her vision. "Harmony Gardens has tremendous potential, but it's being wasted on its current purpose. We could transform this space into something truly remarkable. Luxury condominiums with a memorial garden, perhaps a small museum dedicated to Duke's heroism. Imagine how many people could be inspired by his story." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon heat. "You want to turn the park into condominiums?" "We want to honor this dog's legacy while creating something that will benefit the entire community," Victoria corrected. "Property values would increase dramatically. The tax revenue alone would fund improvements throughout Springfield. It's a win-win situation for everyone involved." Bill stood slowly, his arthritic joints protesting the sudden movement, but his voice remained steady. "Everyone except the families who use this park. Everyone except the children who play here. Everyone except Duke, who chose this place for reasons we're only beginning to understand." Victoria's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your emotional attachment to this space, but emotion doesn't pay for medical bills. That dog needs expensive treatment, doesn't he? Kidney disease, according to my sources." Surgery alone will cost $15,000, and the ongoing care will be substantial. The fact that Victoria knew about Duke's medical condition sent alarm bells ringing in Sheriff Bradley's mind. He'd been careful to keep that information confidential while Duke recovered, sharing it only with Bill, Eleanor, and Dr. Mitchell. How had this woman learned details that should have been private? "My sources tell me you're living on a teacher's pension, Mr. Thompson," Victoria continued, her voice taking on a sympathetic tone that felt rehearsed. $1,500 a month doesn't leave much room for veterinary emergencies, does it? But if you were to support our development proposal, Sterling Corporation would be happy to cover all of Duke's medical expenses. Consider it an investment in community goodwill. The offer hung in the air like smoke from a brush fire, appealing and dangerous in equal measure. Bill could see the calculations running through the minds of his neighbors, the tempting arithmetic of financial relief balanced against abstract concepts like community preservation. Eleanor, however, was focused on different calculations entirely. She'd spent enough time around corporate predators to recognize one when she saw it, and Victoria Sterling's approach bore all the hallmarks of a hostile takeover disguised as benevolence. "How did you learn about Duke's medical condition?" Eleanor asked quietly, but her voice carried the steel that had helped her survive 64 years in a world that often underestimated women of her generation. Victoria's hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, but Eleanor caught it. "It's a small town. Word travels quickly when a community hero needs help." "Word travels," Eleanor repeated. "Or surveillance equipment provides detailed information." The accusation hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down, and Victoria's mask finally slipped completely. For just a moment, her polished exterior revealed something calculating and cold, something that suggested she knew far more about recent events in Springfield than any casual observer should. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Victoria said, but her voice had lost its earlier warmth. "Sterling Development is simply offering to be part of the solution to a community problem." Sheriff Bradley had been listening to the exchange with growing concern, his law enforcement instincts triggered by Victoria's knowledge of confidential information and her perfectly timed arrival just as Duke's medical bills became a pressing concern. The hidden cameras, the surveillance equipment, the mysterious monitoring of Duke's activities. Suddenly, he was seeing connections that painted a disturbing picture. "Mizzy." "Sterling," Bradley said, stepping forward with the deliberate authority of his badge. "I'm going to need to ask you some questions about how your company learned about this dog's condition and your interest in this particular property." Victoria's response was immediate and revealing. Instead of the cooperation that an innocent business person would offer, she took a step backward and glanced toward her Mercedes as if calculating the distance to an escape route. "I don't have time for questions right now, Sheriff. I have other appointments, but Mr. Thompson, my offer stands. Sterling Development can solve your problems, but our timeline is limited. We need a decision within 30 days. She turned toward her car, then paused and looked back with an expression that seemed almost personal, as if this wasn't just business but something deeper and more complicated. 30 days, Mr. Thompson. After that, the offer expires and you'll be left with bills you can't pay and a dog you can't save." As the Mercedes disappeared down Main Street, Eleanor placed her hand on Bill's shoulder and squeezed gently. "She knows too much about Duke, about his condition, about your finances. This isn't a coincidence." Bill nodded slowly, his mind racing through implications he didn't want to consider. "The cameras. Someone's been watching us, gathering information, waiting for the right moment to make their move." Duke, who had remained calm throughout the confrontation, suddenly stood and moved to the edge of the park, his nose raised to catch a scent that the humans couldn't detect. His body language shifted into the alert posture they'd learned to recognize as his warning stance, suggesting that whoever had been watching them might still be nearby. Dr. Mitchell, who had arrived during Victoria's presentation to check on Duke's healing, watched the German Shepherd's behavior with professional concern. His stress levels are elevated. Whatever just happened here, it's affecting him physically. The realization that Duke was responding to threats they couldn't see reminded them all that they were dealing with forces beyond their understanding. Someone had been watching their community, gathering intelligence, and waiting for the right moment to exploit their emotional attachments and financial vulnerabilities. Victoria Sterling's 30-day deadline wasn't just a business proposal, it was an ultimatum that would force them to choose between Duke's life and their community's heart. And somewhere in the shadows, the people who had been monitoring their every move were counting on them to make the choice that served corporate interests rather than human ones. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Harmony Gardens, Bill found himself wondering if saving Duke would mean losing everything else they'd fought to protect. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 12 days after Victoria Sterling's ultimatum. Bill woke to the sound of Duke whimpering, a sound he'd never heard from the stoic German Shepherd who had endured rocks, injuries, and abandonment without complaint. When Bill reached the living room, he found Duke collapsed beside his water bowl, his breathing labored and his amber eyes clouded with pain. "Easy, boy," Bill whispered, his hands trembling as he felt for Duke's pulse. The heartbeat was irregular, too fast, and the dog's gums had taken on a grayish pallor that Bill recognized from Martha's final days. Kidney failure was accelerating faster than anyone had predicted. The emergency veterinary clinic was 20 miles away, and Bill's aging Toyota struggled with the pre-dawn darkness and his panicked driving. Duke lay motionless in the passenger seat, wrapped in Martha's favorite quilt, his breathing growing more shallow with each passing mile. Bill found himself bargaining with a God he'd stopped talking to regularly since Martha's death, promising things he wasn't sure he could deliver if Duke would just hold on a little longer. Dr. Mitchell met them at the clinic, having been roused from sleep by Bill's frantic phone call. His examination confirmed what they all feared. Duke's condition had deteriorated catastrophically. The stress of recent events, combined with months of poor nutrition and inadequate care, had pushed his damaged kidneys past the point of medical management. "He needs surgery immediately," Dr. Mitchell said, his voice carrying the weight of delivering news that would shatter hearts. "Without intervention within the next 6 hours, we'll lose him. But Mr. Thompson, the costs. We're looking at $15,000 for the surgery alone, and that doesn't include post-operative care, medications, or the possibility of complications." Bill's savings account contained $247. His checking account held enough to cover groceries for another week. The equity in his house was already leveraged against Martha's medical bills, and his pension wouldn't cover a fraction of what Duke needed. "Do the surgery," Eleanor's voice cut through his anguished calculations. She had arrived at the clinic within minutes of Bill's call to her, still wearing her nightgown under a hastily thrown-on coat. "I told you before, I'll cover whatever he needs." "Eleanor, I can't." "You can, and you will," she interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "This dog chose us, Bill. All of us. And sometimes being chosen means accepting help when pride would rather we suffer alone." As Duke was prepared for emergency surgery, word spread through Springfield's close-knit community with the speed that only crisis could generate. By dawn, the veterinary clinic's parking lot was filled with pickups and sedans, their occupants maintaining a silent vigil for the dog who had protected their children and brought their community together. Margaret Sullivan arrived with coffee and homemade muffins, her eyes red from crying. Father O'Connor came to offer prayers and comfort. Even teenagers who had initially thrown rocks now stood quietly with their parents, their young faces etched with guilt and concern. The surgery stretched through the morning hours, each minute feeling like an eternity to the gathered crowd. Dr. Mitchell emerged periodically to provide updates, but his expressions grew increasingly grave as complications mounted. Duke's kidneys were more damaged than the imaging had revealed, and his body was struggling to handle the anesthesia that his weakened system couldn't properly process. At 11:43 a.m., the machines monitoring Duke's vital signs began emitting the steady, soul-crushing tone that medical personnel and families worldwide recognize as the sound of ending. Dr. Mitchell worked frantically to restart the German Shepherd's heart, using techniques that pushed the boundaries of veterinary medicine, but Duke's body had finally surrendered to months of accumulated trauma. Bill felt something fundamental break inside his chest as the monitors confirmed what his heart already knew. Duke was gone, and with him went something irreplaceable. Not just a dog, but a bridge between past and present, between grief and healing, between a community's capacity for cruelty and its potential for redemption. Eleanor wrapped her arms around Bill as he sobbed against her shoulder, both of them mourning not just Duke, but everything he had represented. The teenagers in the parking lot wept openly, finally understanding the true cost of their initial cruelty. Margaret Sullivan clutched her granddaughter Emma, who kept asking why the good dog couldn't wake up. But as the community prepared to say farewell to their unlikely hero, Dr. Mitchell was making one final attempt to honor Duke's fighting spirit. Working with equipment that stretched his clinic's capabilities, he administered experimental medications and continued chest compressions long past the point where protocol would have dictated stopping. At 12:07 p.m., 24 minutes after Duke's heart had stopped, the monitors suddenly erupted with the irregular but unmistakable rhythm of a heartbeat fighting its way back to life. Duke's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware, and his tail moved with the faintest suggestion of recognition when he heard Bill's voice calling his name. The miracle of Duke's resurrection sent shockwaves through the clinic, and the crowd gathered outside. People who hadn't prayed in years found themselves offering thanks to whatever power had granted a second chance to a dog who had given everything to protect others. But even as Duke stabilized and began the slow process of recovery, the shadow of Victoria Sterling's ultimatum loomed over their celebration. They had 18 days remaining before her deadline expired, and Duke's medical bills had grown beyond even Eleanor's generous offer to cover them. The experimental treatments and extended surgery had pushed costs to nearly $30,000, with ongoing care requirements that would stretch indefinitely into the future. More troubling was the realization that Duke's near-death experience had been triggered by stress factors that hadn't been present before Victoria's arrival. Dr. Mitchell's blood work revealed elevated cortisol levels consistent with chronic anxiety, suggesting that Duke's body was responding to threats that the humans around him couldn't fully perceive. Sheriff Bradley had spent Duke's surgery hours investigating Victoria Sterling and her company, uncovering connections that painted an increasingly sinister picture. Sterling Development had a pattern of targeting small communities with emotional leverage points, elderly residents with limited resources, beloved local landmarks threatened by development pressure, and financial crises that made corporate buyouts seem like salvation rather than exploitation. The hidden cameras throughout Harmony Gardens had been just the beginning of a sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation designed to identify the community's vulnerabilities and pressure points. Victoria's knowledge of Duke's medical condition, Bill's financial struggles, and Eleanor's hidden wealth suggested a level of surveillance that extended far beyond simple business research. As Duke fought his way back from the edge of death, his human family realized they were facing an enemy who had studied their weaknesses with surgical precision and was prepared to exploit their love for each other to achieve corporate objectives that would destroy everything they held dear. The battle for Duke's life had been won, but the war for their community's soul was just beginning. The truth that would change everything began with a single photograph tucked inside a manila envelope that Sheriff Bradley found slipped under his office door on a gray Thursday morning 6 days after Duke's miraculous recovery. The image showed Victoria Sterling shaking hands with Carl Morrison, the registered sex offender who had been stalking children in Harmony Gardens before Duke's intervention had forced him to flee. Bradley's hands trembled as he studied the photograph's timestamp, which placed the meeting 3 weeks before Morrison had begun his surveillance of the park. The implications were staggering and sickening. Victoria Sterling hadn't simply been monitoring their community for development opportunities. She had been orchestrating a campaign of terror designed to create the exact crisis that would justify her corporate takeover. The envelope contained more than just the photograph. A second document, bearing the letterhead of a private investigation firm in Kansas City, detailed payments from Sterling Development to Morrison, totaling $15,000 over a 3-month period. The services listed were vaguely described as community safety assessment and threat analysis, but the real purpose was becoming horrifyingly clear. Morrison had been hired to create safety concerns that would make Harmony Gardens appear dangerous to families, driving down property values and creating public support for Sterling's development proposal. The plan had been elegant in its cruelty. Use Springfield's own protective instincts against them by manufacturing threats that only corporate intervention could solve. But the scheme had encountered an unexpected obstacle in the form of a German shepherd, whose training and instincts had allowed him to identify the real predator among them. Duke's protective interventions had disrupted Morrison's carefully planned campaign of intimidation, forcing Sterling to pivot to more direct pressure tactics involving medical emergencies and financial manipulation. Bradley's investigation into the source of the anonymous evidence led him to Jerry Martinez, the groundskeeper who had discovered the first hidden camera. Jerry had been approached by a woman claiming to represent a documentary filmmaker interested in stories about therapy dogs and community healing. She had paid him $500 for access to maintenance areas throughout the park and permission to install temporary monitoring equipment to capture Duke's daily routines. "She seemed so nice," Jerry told Bradley, his voice heavy with guilt and confusion. "Said she wanted to tell Duke's story, help people understand how animals can heal communities." "I never thought, who would hurt a dog on purpose?" The woman Jerry described matched Victoria Sterling perfectly. But when Bradley attempted to trace her documentary company credentials, he discovered they were completely fabricated. Sterling Development had created an elaborate false identity to gain access to Springfield's infrastructure, using Jerry's unwitting cooperation to establish the surveillance network that had monitored their community's most vulnerable moments. As Bradley pieced together the scope of Sterling's operation, he realized they were dealing with something far more sophisticated than simple corporate greed. The level of psychological manipulation, the careful exploitation of emotional attachments, and the willingness to endanger children suggested a conspiracy that extended beyond real estate development into something darker and more personal. The breakthrough came when Bradley decided to dig deeper into Victoria Sterling's background, using resources available through law enforcement databases that civilian investigations couldn't access. What he discovered about Victoria's true identity sent shockwaves through his understanding of everything that had happened in Springfield. Victoria Sterling wasn't just a corporate predator targeting their community for profit. She was Victoria Thompson, Bill's estranged daughter who had disappeared from Springfield 23 years earlier after a bitter confrontation that had torn their family apart forever. The revelation hit Bradley like a physical blow. Victoria had been 18 when she'd left home, pregnant and furious at her parents for what she perceived as their failure to support her dreams of leaving their small town behind. Martha and Bill had wanted her to stay, to raise her child in Springfield where family support would be available, but Victoria had seen their advice as an attempt to trap her in the same limited life they'd chosen for themselves. The pregnancy had ended in miscarriage during Victoria's second month away from home, but her resentment toward her parents had only deepened with grief and isolation. She'd blamed them for the loss, convinced that the stress of their final argument had contributed to her body's failure to sustain the life she'd carried. The rational part of her mind knew better, but grief rarely listened to reason. For 23 years, Victoria had built a successful career in real estate development while nursing a wound that had never healed. She'd married, divorced, achieved financial success, and traveled the world, but Springfield had remained an unhealed sore in her psyche, the place where she'd lost everything that mattered and been forced to choose between family loyalty and personal freedom. Martha's death 3 years earlier had been reported in trade publications that tracked significant life events of successful business executives. Victoria had learned of her mother's passing through a corporate newsletter, the news arriving as a brief paragraph between stock market analyses and merger announcements. She'd read about the funeral she hadn't attended, the community support she hadn't provided, and the husband she'd left to grieve alone. The guilt and rage of that moment had crystallized into a plan for revenge that was both sophisticated and deeply personal. Victoria wouldn't simply buy and develop Harmony Gardens. She would destroy the community that had shaped her parents' values, prove that their small-town idealism was worthless in the face of economic reality, and force her father to choose between his principles and his survival. Duke had become the perfect weapon for this revenge because Bill's attachment to the dog mirrored the emotional connections that Victoria blamed for her own trapped childhood. By threatening Duke's life through manufactured medical emergencies and financial pressure, she could force her father to experience the same impossible choices that had driven her away from Springfield decades earlier. But as Bradley studied the evidence of Victoria's elaborate scheme, he realized there was something else at work beyond simple revenge. The surveillance equipment, the careful documentation of community interactions, and the psychological profiling of residents suggested that Victoria had been studying her father's life with the intensity of someone trying to understand rather than simply destroy. She had watched Bill's daily routines, his interactions with Duke, his growing friendship with Eleanor, and his role as an informal community elder. She had seen the man he'd become in the decades since she'd left home, not the rigid authority figure she remembered from her adolescence, but a grieving widower who had found purpose in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Dr. Mitchell's call interrupted Bradley's investigation with news that sent a chill through his understanding of Victoria's timeline. Duke's blood work from his emergency surgery had revealed traces of a mild toxin, nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough to accelerate his kidney disease and create the medical crisis that had nearly killed him. "It's not something he would have encountered naturally," Dr. Mitchell explained. "This is a synthetic compound that would have to be administered deliberately, probably through food or water over a period of weeks. Whoever did this knew exactly how to create a slow-building health crisis that would appear to be natural progression of his existing condition." The realization that Victoria had been slowly poisoning Duke added a level of cruelty to her revenge that made Bradley's blood run cold. She hadn't simply exploited Duke's existing health problems. She had actively caused his suffering, using his pain as leverage against a father who had already lost too much. But as Bradley prepared to arrest Victoria Sterling for animal cruelty, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges, he discovered that she had vanished as completely as Carl Morrison. Her Mercedes was found abandoned at the Springfield bus station, and security cameras showed her boarding a Greyhound headed for Kansas City with a single suitcase and the hollow expression of someone who had accomplished her mission but found no satisfaction in victory. The envelope containing evidence of her crimes had been her confession, a final gesture that suggested Victoria's revenge had ultimately turned against herself. She had succeeded in causing pain, but in doing so had confirmed that the family connections she'd rejected were real and powerful enough to inspire the kind of community response that had saved Duke's life and exposed her scheme. Eleanor, who had been listening to Bradley's explanation with growing horror and heartbreak, reached out to touch Bill's shoulder as the truth of his daughter's betrayal settled over them like a shroud. "She's been watching you all these years," Eleanor whispered, "studying your life, learning what would hurt you most." Bill's response came from a place deeper than anger or betrayal. It came from the profound sadness of a father who had failed to bridge a gap that time had only widened. "She wanted me to suffer the way she's been suffering," he said quietly. "She wanted me to understand what it feels like to lose everything that matters." Duke, who had been resting peacefully during their conversation, suddenly lifted his head and moved to Bill's side, pressing his warm body against the old man's legs in a gesture of comfort that transcended human understanding of loyalty and forgiveness. 1 year later, on a crisp September morning that painted Harmony Gardens in shades of gold and amber, Bill Thompson sat on the bench beneath the old oak tree with a leather-bound book in his lap, and Duke resting peacefully at his feet. The German shepherd's coat had regained its lustrous shine, and though he moved more slowly now, his amber eyes remained alert and kind, watching over the children who played nearby with the patient dignity of a guardian who understood his purpose. The book Bill held was titled Lessons from Harmony Gardens, A Small Town's Journey Through Darkness to Light, and his name appeared on the cover as the author. A dream that had seemed impossible during those dark months when grief and loneliness had consumed his days. Martha's voice had guided him through the writing process, her memory helping him find words for experiences that had seemed beyond description. The dedication page read simply, "To Martha, who taught me that love never truly ends, to Duke, who showed me that heroes come in many forms, and to Victoria, who reminded me that family bonds survive even the deepest wounds." The book's publication by a small Missouri press had surprised everyone, including Bill. The story of Duke's heroism and the community's journey had resonated with readers across the Midwest, generating enough sales to establish a modest scholarship fund for Springfield High School students pursuing careers in education or veterinary medicine. More importantly, it had provided Bill with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since retiring from teaching. Eleanor approached from the path that led to the new memorial garden, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and wearing the contented smile that had become her trademark since she'd stopped pretending to be poor and started using her wealth to strengthen her community. The Bobby Chen Memorial Veterans Garden occupied the space where Victoria had planned to build luxury condominiums, its peaceful walkways and therapeutic landscaping providing a healing environment for veterans struggling with PTSD and other service-related trauma. "Dr. Mitchell says Duke's latest blood work is the best it's been since his surgery," Eleanor reported, settling beside Bill on the bench with the easy familiarity of an old friend. "The experimental treatments are working better than anyone hoped." Duke's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous, though Dr. Mitchell cautioned that the German Shepherd would always require careful monitoring and expensive medications. Eleanor's anonymous donation had established the Duke Foundation, which covered veterinary expenses for therapy animals and service dogs whose handlers couldn't afford necessary medical care. The foundation had already helped dozens of animals across Missouri, creating a legacy that extended far beyond their small town. "Any word from Kansas City?" Eleanor asked gently, knowing that Bill checked his email every morning for messages that never came. Bill shook his head, his expression carrying the complex mixture of hope and acceptance that characterized his feelings about Victoria. After her disappearance, he had hired a private investigator to locate her, not for legal action but for reconciliation. The investigator had found her working for a nonprofit organization that developed affordable housing for low-income families, a career change that suggested Victoria's schemes against Springfield had forced her to confront her own values and motivations. "I write to her," Bill said quietly, watching a young mother push her toddler on the playground swings that Victoria's development would have demolished. "Every week, I send a letter to her office address. I tell her about Duke's recovery, about the memorial garden, about how the community has grown stronger. I tell her that her room is still waiting for her, that forgiveness doesn't require explanations." The letters remained unanswered, but Bill continued writing them with the patience of a teacher who understood that some lessons took time to absorb. He knew that Victoria was reading them. The private investigator had confirmed as much, and that knowledge was enough to sustain his hope for eventual reconciliation. Father O'Connor joined them on the bench, his presence adding the comfortable weight of spiritual authority to their morning ritual. At 71, the priest had become something of a local celebrity after his sermon about Duke had been featured in a religious magazine, but he remained the same humble shepherd who had guided Springfield's souls for 4 decades. "The documentary crew is setting up near the playground," Father O'Connor reported. "They want to film Duke interacting with the children for their closing segment." The documentary about Duke's story had been initiated by legitimate filmmakers from St. Louis who had read Bill's book and been moved by the themes of redemption and community healing. Unlike Victoria's fabricated documentary company, this production was creating an authentic record of how a small town had transformed trauma into triumph. Margaret Sullivan arrived with her granddaughter Emma, now 7 years old, and Duke's most devoted young friend. Emma had overcome her initial fear of dogs through patient interactions with Duke, who seemed to understand that she needed extra gentleness after their traumatic first encounter. The little girl now volunteered at the Memorial Gardens therapy sessions, reading stories to veterans, while Duke provided quiet comfort. "Mr. Thompson," Emma said with the seriousness that only children could bring to important announcements, "Duke told me something this morning." Bill smiled, accustomed to Emma's conversations with Duke that seemed to involve more genuine communication than most adults achieved with their own pets. "What did he tell you, sweetheart?" "He said he's not sad anymore," Emma replied, stroking Duke's head with gentle reverence. "He said he found his new job taking care of all of us, and that's better than being sad about his old job." The wisdom contained in a 7-year-old's interpretation of Duke's journey struck Bill with unexpected force. Duke had indeed found a new purpose in Springfield, transforming from a therapy dog serving one traumatized veteran to a community healer whose presence provided comfort to anyone who needed it. Sheriff Bradley approached with news that had become routine but remained welcome. Crime rates in Springfield continued to decline, tourism revenue was increasing due to visitors drawn by Duke's story, and property values had risen steadily without the destructive development that Victoria had proposed. The park had become a destination for families from across Missouri, drawn by the story of a dog who had protected children and a community that had protected him in return. The State Tourism Board wants to designate Harmony Gardens as an official Missouri heritage site, Bradley reported. Duke would become the first therapy animal to receive that honor. The recognition represented validation of everything they had fought to preserve, but more importantly, it ensured that Duke's story would continue inspiring future generations long after his time with them had ended. Dr. Mitchell joined the growing circle around Duke, his presence a reminder of the medical miracle that had saved their friend's life and the ongoing care required to maintain his health. The veterinarian had become something of an expert in treating elderly working dogs, consulting with colleagues across the country who were dealing with similar cases of service animals aging out of their original roles. "He's teaching us as much as we're helping him," Dr. Mitchell observed, watching Duke navigate the subtle social dynamics of the group with the instinctive wisdom that characterized his breed. Every interaction he has with trauma survivors, every child he comforts, every moment of peace he provides, it's all data that's helping us understand how animal therapy can heal wounds we didn't even know existed. As the documentary crew began filming, capturing the quiet magic of Duke's interactions with his extended human family, Bill reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. A year ago, he had been a lonely widower counting quarters to buy dog food. Eleanor had been hiding her wealth while starving for genuine connection, and Duke had been a traumatized veteran searching for purpose after losing his handler to the invisible wounds of war. Victoria's scheme to destroy their community had instead revealed its hidden strengths, forcing neighbors to choose between fear and compassion, isolation and connection, revenge and forgiveness. The choices they had made, to protect Duke despite community pressure, to support each other despite individual limitations, to seek truth despite comfortable assumptions, had transformed them all into better versions of themselves. The late morning sun streamed through the oak tree's branches, casting dappled shadows across the memorial garden where veterans found peace, children learned empathy, and a German shepherd named Duke continued his mission of healing one heart at a time. Bill opened his book to the final chapter and began reading aloud to his assembled family, his voice carrying Martha's wisdom and his own hard-earned understanding of how broken things could be made whole again. In the distance, a car with Kansas plates pulled into the parking lot, and Bill's heart skipped as he recognized the silhouette of a woman who had been absent from his life for 23 years, but never absent from his prayers. Sometimes life gives us second chances when we least expect them, but need them most. Duke's story reminds us that it's never too late to find purpose, build new families, or heal old wounds. Bill thought his best days were behind him, a lonely widower counting pennies, watching life pass by from a park bench. Eleanor believed money couldn't buy what she truly craved, genuine human connection and someone to care for. Both discovered that love has no expiration date, and the most broken hearts often have the most room for healing. Duke showed us that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they have 4 legs and amber eyes full of wisdom. He protected children when no one understood, brought together a fractured community, and proved that loyalty and service don't end with retirement. Most powerfully, he taught us that families aren't just born, they're chosen, built one act of kindness at a time. Your golden years aren't about winding down, they're about discovering what truly matters. Like Bill and Eleanor, you might find that your greatest adventures, deepest friendships, and most meaningful purpose are still waiting to be written. What Duke has appeared in your life when you needed hope most? How has an unexpected friendship or purpose transformed your later years? Share your story below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.